I want to add a little bit to what you've all said from my perspective, and it has to do with the 21st century as being such a hyper visual moment. And it's been in the works since the late 20th century. And one could say, particularly starting in the 1980s, the proliferation of digital images and cable and satellite and the ability for us to see and grasp things, images from all over the world, has to factor perhaps a little bit into this. And I'm thinking in particular of the end part of the title of our panel tonight, Artists of African Descent. This is a term, a concept that's been used historically, but it takes particular resonance, I would say, as we move from the 20th century into the 21st century. There is a real sense that US, France, UK, South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, Jamaica, Haiti, that these parts of the African diaspora, they've been in conversation with one another, but they seem especially in conversation with one another. Could you all speak, any of you, to the fact that we're talking about this globally?
I think of a moment, say, around 1996, 1997, and looking at the proliferation of exhibitions that took on exactly that theme that you just said. Shows like Inclusion, Exclusion by Peter Weibel in '96. Then followed that year not only by this sort of grand tour of Venice, of Münster, of Documenta, but at that moment, it was one of the first times, I think, where you also had Johannesburg for the second time. You had Istanbul, you had Gwangju, picking up on Dakar. We even think of those exhibitions and what it meant to a developing dialogue that was precipitated in many ways by communication and by the fact that email was becoming more of a vehicle for sharing information and such an easy way to do that.
It also, I mean, Franklin has marked that moment, but I would say I'd pinpoint it very specifically to Okwe and Wazor's Johannesburg Biennale, right? Both that term, artists of African descent, and the idea that the imperative was that we weren't going to speak about a kind of Black history that cited itself in America and then an engagement with the diaspora. But we were sort of almost talking about rethinking Africa as the center and looking at artists of African descent as emanating from that center. And that's when I think that really happened, and we began to think of it that way. And when you look at the list of the artists that were included in that exhibition, in many cases, it predicts in a way that's incredibly brilliant the way in which this dialogue would play out now, 20 years later. Like literally, that checklist alone.
Thank you.
I think my wake-up moment for African art was Susan Vogel's exhibition, Africa Explores, at the Museum for African Art in New York. It was the first time I was aware of the wealth and the breadth of art, contemporary art that was being produced on the continent. I had a fixed image in my mind, I think, that of what we call traditional African art was African art, and that was the definition of it. And it just broke up all my definitions. It just threw them away, and I had to start all over again, and which was a thrill, of course, because it just opened this wonderfully rich world. And it was a very experimental show. You know, it was in an Upper East Side townhouse, and it was this very not Upper East Side townhousey kind of art, and so that's when things started to change for me, I think, with that show, and yeah.
I'm just thinking of like around '89 and thinking about some of the exhibitions within that moment and coming back to a sort of New York moment that perhaps precipitated some of the international conversation around exhibitions like the Decade Show, and thinking about how we represented ourselves within an American context that I think would not have existed without the ties outside to Africa, to Asia, beyond.
Franklin, I'm so glad you mentioned the Decade Show, and I remember the premiere of Looking for Langston by Isaac Julian. Black British artist who does this incredible meditation on, not so much on Langston Hughes, but on 1989 and being a Black gay artist and individual in a world that opens its eyes to this new persona, you know. And so the late 80s really is implicated here, and particularly in terms of that route between New York and London.
Yeah, something that Thelma has talked about a lot, I think within that conversation, we also were reminded of it with Sensation around the same time, and Chris O'Feely's presence, so huge, looming over that exhibition, was also part of that moment, and then thinking about Magicien de la Terre from the same year, which widens the circle even more and goes towards, say, that installation that we see now, where you have this idea of self-taught and vernacular playing such an important role vis-a-vis the Picasso on the other side of the room.
And these shows that I felt were so important did not come from the center.
Right.
They came from the edges, from the periphery. And I think it woke me up, just speaking personally, to take my focus off of the center and move my sights out. And I've kept them there because once I did, I realized that's where the interesting stuff is happening. Still is.
Except now we don't call it the margin anymore.
We don't call it the margin anymore, no.
True. We don't call it the margin.
No, we don't.
But you know, it's so important, Holland, that you've been doing that because you really are such a champion of that. And it's always so interesting to read what you write. And I think it's so important. You know, even when you think about the article that was in the New York Times a month ago on that Sunday, the big article that, you know, talked about this whole topic, and, you know, a few people came up to me and said, so, oh, it must be great now. Everything's all better and it's all done and, you know, wow.
Yeah.
But what that article does, first it was so important that it was on a Sunday and that in the Times and, you know, front page. But I think what it does is people read that and it becomes kind of a shared consciousness. And so, you know, although things don't happen right away from it, it shows that, oh, this is happening. And a lot of people probably had no idea that all of this was going on. And, you know, so that's so important, I think, articles like that, things like that. But it was really interesting how everybody thought, okay, well, that's great, it's done. And there's a long way to go still, I think.
So our experience with globalization is a little bit more pedestrian. About a decade ago, I had a need to move with my husband to London, and I began to meet artists like Isaac Julian and Frank Bowling and Chris O'Feely, and then you have this epiphany that this dialogue is a global one. And London is a really interesting place because not only is there sort of cross-fertilization between London and the US, but London's a really global city that, you know, attracts artists from really all over the world. And so that was a real eye-opener for us. And that's the moment at which we took our collection to a global place. And our definition of the African diaspora now includes artists that do not necessarily identify themselves as Black artists. And so we have a whole narrative around how those individuals and how that work came into the collection in dialogue, say, with African-American abstract painting from the 1940s. I mean, speaking of that article, the New York Times, I was thrilled and picked up the paper just like everybody else and saw one of the paintings in our collection pictured on the front page of the New York Times. I said, oh, well, there it is. It's okay. But the point is that ours is a really personal journey built building block by building block, not just with the individual paintings, but, you know, just weaving in the personal experiences and dialogue we have with the individual artist.